During the War of 1812, the forces of the British Empire, after having repelled several attempted thrusts against the colony of Canada by the fledgling United States, undertook a daring occupation on the American capital during 1814, when 3,500 soldiers and 1,000 Royal Marines marched into and burned the seat of the American government at Washington, D.C. This attack on the city being the first and so far only instance of a foreign army successfully invading and capturing the home of American democracy. Officially commencing in June of its titular year, the War of 1812, also known as the Second War of Independence, was fought between the factions of the British Empire and the recently established United States of America, the causes to this conflict being primarily due to Britain's existing involvement in the Napoleonic Wars of continental Europe, where a mixture of American trade to France being halted due to blockades by British ships, together with the press ganging of US sailors into the Royal Navy, who were considered to be British subjects, served to exacerbate existing tensions between the expansion of the United States into areas ruled by the indigenous populations of North America. With both nations enlisting the assistance of Native American tribes, the British had a stronger position due to their ability to call upon the Spanish Empire from 1813 as an ally, as well as its pre-established bases in the colony of Canada. The Americans, while being able to achieve many victories against the British, being largely unsuccessful in their campaign along the borderlands of southern Canada, with the British hitting back hard and repelling most American advances, made more difficult following the defeat of the Emperor Napoleon of France in April 1814, when he was forced to abdicate after Paris was seized by a coalition of allied European nations against the French, and thus allowed more British troops to be redirected into the American conflict. On August 24, 1814, the Battle of Bladensburg in Maryland occurred, approximately 8.6 miles northeast of the American capital of Washington, D.C., as part of the Chesapeake campaign of Major General Robert Ross, who had marched his army of 3,500 men plus 1,000 Royal Marines 50 miles from their landing positions at Benedict, on the shores of the Patuxent River, to within a stone's throw of the American capital, command of the United States forces sent to repel the British advance being assumed by the then President himself, James Madison, together with future President James Monroe and Brigadier General William Winder. Winder's inability to successfully command his troops, together with a general lack of experience when it came to military leadership from President Madison, seeing the American forces easily put to flight by the British. Leaving a clear road for Ross to send his army into the largely undefended capital, the Major General was hesitant to mount a full-scale occupation of Washington, D.C., due to his lack of cavalry and significant artillery pieces, the only support for his land assault being a small naval attack squadron being sent to bombard the port of Alexandria on the banks of the Potomac River, as led by Captain James Gordon, his motivation ultimately coming down to his need to set an example to the Americans following their own destructive raids on property in Canada, such as the raid on Port Dover, Ontario by American forces that destroyed grain stocks and mills essential for the welfare of British troops, while the city of York, then the capital of Upper Canada, had been looted and burned to the ground by American raiders. Ross judging these actions as a violation of the laws of war and choosing to retaliate in a likewise manner with the American capital. He was, however, hesitant to be wanton with his destruction, as despite the recommendations of Rear Admiral George Cockburn, who had commanded the attack squadron of Royal Navy ships in Chesapeake Bay during the landing of troops in Maryland, to have the capital burned to the ground, Ross opted instead to spare almost all of the private property, choosing to focus on setting alight governmental structures and military buildings, such as the presidential mansion, the residence of the American head of state and a precursor to the modern White House, and the Capitol building, the home of America's Senate and House of Representatives, the British invaders promptly storming the city and immediately setting upon the Capitol building, as it was by far the most iconic structure in terms of both aesthetics and symbolism, the redcoats entering through the southern wing, which was home to the House of Representatives, and then invading through the northern wing, which was home to the Senate, a round of thorough looting taking place before the British attackers set the Capitol alight, with the flames spreading so quickly that it forced them to retreat before they could gather enough wood to completely burn the stone walls, though the priceless documents within the Library of Congress, together with countless works of art in the halls, worked well in stoking the fire. Next came the presidential mansion, though shortly before British troops set upon the building, James Madison's wife, Dolly Madison, had been ordered by her husband to prepare for a speedy departure if necessary, gathering the staff, including slaves, to help collect valuables so as to avoid their destruction at the hands of the rapidly advancing enemy, among these items being a large portrait of George Washington, which survived the war and is now on display at the National Portrait Gallery. The British, in order to ensure the maximum destruction of the presidential mansion, taking their time and working meticulously to ensure that the entire building would burn through the night, while the United States Treasury and United States Department of War buildings were also set ablaze, though Ross, true to his word that private properties would not be harmed in the burning of the city, ensured that the home of the local newspaper, the National Intelligencer, was pulled apart brick by brick so as to avoid damage to surrounding houses. The sacking of Washington D.C. didn't last long, though, as shortly after the attack began, a dangerous storm blew in that extinguished the flames of the falling buildings, the rainfall helping to save the Capitol from complete destruction, with the House Rotunda, the East Lobby, the staircases, and Latrobe's famous corn-cob columns in the Senate entrance hall being saved from the fire, the storm being accompanied by a violent tornado that killed both British and Americans alike, and sent the cannons of the invaders hurtling through the air, the storm not only destroying some of the British ships on the Potomac River, but also resulted in the ruin of private properties promised by Ross to have been spared from his army's wrath. Ultimately, the damage inflicted by the storm caused Ross to pull his forces out of the capital after 26 hours of occupation, his army withdrawing back south towards Pig Point, Maryland, and leaving in its wake a city in disarray and shambles, to which President Madison and other officials would ultimately return on September 1st, vowing that the citizens of the District of Columbia would unite to defend and rebuild the capital, despite the protests of some members of Congress who believed that a new city should be established elsewhere, these contrary viewpoints being rapidly swept aside by the president, who immediately saw that the seat of American political power be re-established in Washington with the construction of the Old Brick Capitol, a temporary structure that was completed in early 1815, around the time that the War of 1812 was eventually resolved with the signing of the Treaty of Ghent, which essentially restored the positions of both nations to that prevailing before the war, the building of the Old Brick Capitol being funded by Washington property owners and took 5 months to complete, serving in the role of housing the American political system until 1819, after which the White House and the original Capitol building had been restored to their former glory. Opinions as to the destruction of Washington, D.C. among the British being contentious, as while some factions believed it was a justified act of revenge, others were horrified by the wanton vandalism caused by the British troops, receiving condemnation from several major European powers. Nonetheless, the capture of Washington, D.C., as of 2023, is the only instance in history that the American capital has fallen into enemy hands since the Revolutionary War, and while this event has gone down in history as one of the most renowned acts of wanton destruction in both British and American history, the restraint showed by Major General Ross as to the handling of his revenge illustrated that his intention was more symbolic rather than mindless or indulgent, with more of the devastation coming in the ensuing storm and tornado that ravaged those parts of the city not burned by the British. This act of nature, though brutal in its wrath, coming to pass as the saviour of Washington, as British troops were driven out of its tattered remains, upon which the newly established American nation could rebuild its capital city and look forward to its ever-rising position on the global stage.